This video is brought to you by the patrons. If you too want to help support the channel and get early access to new videos, then visit patreon.com/Salari. There is a 4-letter word that provokes a response in a lot of people. This word has existed for hundreds of years and has recently been given additional definitions, ones that some see as positive and others see as negative. It's not the word that begins with an F or a C. It can be said on television at any time of day, on any channel, and it's not a word that would get a child in trouble if they were caught saying it. This word is woke, a term that originated from African American vernacular English that has existed supposedly as far back as the 1930s, the first documented instance being at the end of a song by Hoodie Leadbelly Ledbetter, where he advised black people who dared to travel through Alabama to stay woke, keep your eyes open. But the word became widespread in the 2010s among younger generations to the point that it had been added to numerous dictionaries. It's a term used to describe being actively attentive of social facts and issues, especially ones pertaining towards issues of racial and social justice, a simple, clear-cut definition. As the word became more prominent though, it found detractors and eventually it gained another definition, a far more negative one, describing something as being politically liberal, as in matters of racial and social justice, especially in a way that is considered unreasonable or extreme. This definition may seem straightforward, but as time has gone by, it's become evident that some people aren't interested or possibly unaware of what woke means when used in a negative context. The only thing that they need to know is that woke equals bad, because they've been told it's bad over and over again. It's kind of like semantic satiation, which you may not have heard of, but it's that phenomenon where you say or look at a word so many times that it starts to lose meaning. A similar thing has happened among the people who despise wokeness. They don't necessarily know what it means, but they know it when they see it, and they know that they don't like it. Maybe even fear it. Since around the mid-2010s, there has been a drastic increase in the amount of young people who have gained some level of social and political awareness. Given that these people belong to generations that grew up alongside the internet and social media, they've been exposed to the experiences of others from different backgrounds all around the world in their own words, rather than through the lens of curated mainstream media, where the events that we are shown are picked by producers with the intent of informing audiences while ensuring that they hold your attention for as long as possible. Historically speaking, news outlets don't tend to prioritize reporting on social injustice. Some might argue that this is because it qualifies as bias, but it could also be said that it's something that's so common that it's difficult to choose what's worthy of the public's attention. In reality, news media, especially ones funded by advertisers, prefer to craft a narrative which is directly relevant to the lives of the audiences that are watching and their surroundings. If you're in the US, then most of the news that you will see will be about things happening in your country. Same if you're in Canada, the UK, China, India, wherever. Understandably, there's only so much that you can fit in a daily newspaper or a 24-hour news cycle. There's all sorts of things happening around the world at any given time, and only so much that you can report on. Something that's made all the more difficult when news outlets focus their efforts on reporting the news as soon as it happens in an attempt to be as relevant as possible. Hence why when something big is happening, you'll see news networks showing shots of nothing happening, because they're waiting for it and they want to keep you waiting so you don't miss out. Social media, despite its many faults, has become an invaluable tool for learning about the people and parts of the world the news isn't interested in or doesn't have the resources to report on. Of course, this is something that's not infallible. After all, we're relying on the words of individuals, and not everyone tells the complete truth, or it can be difficult to do so in only 280 characters. But before the internet, people's knowledge about what was happening with other people and in other parts of the world was a fraction of what it is now. Given that younger people, namely Gen Z and millennials, are the largest user base of social media, they've had their worldview and ideologies influenced by it. Pair this with the fact that young people from a variety of backgrounds have been born into a period of time where they enjoy far fewer privileges than the generations that came before them, it's not hard to conclude that if life is hard for you, then it's harder for people who have even less privilege. The younger generations have found common ground for the most part, and I believe that that's largely because despite our differences in tastes, we were both born into a situation where most of us financially struggle, to the point where it's more than likely that we'll be in debt until the day we die and never be able to buy a house and never retire. I'm sure it'll be fine though. They work hard, do everything right, sacrifice their time and youth for the sake of staying alive. They see online that there are millions of people who share their problems, some of which have it far worse, and realize that it's not the fault of the individual but the system that they exist in. They'll see how people of color and LGBTQ+ people not only share their struggles, often to a greater degree, but they also face persecution from society, which in turn makes things worse for them, and the many problems people in other countries face due to past conflicts and the political meddling of other countries. After seeing all this, it's not hard to conclude that something is wrong and things need to change, not just for you, but for everyone. If you're to do this though, you need to be aware of what's happening. You need to stay woke. Funnily enough though, the word woke isn't really used by progressives anymore, partly because the usage of certain words ebbs and flows, but also because it's become a word that's become so frequently maligned by more conservative groups that its usage carries risk. When debating an issue with others, language can be a tricky thing, and there are some words that you simply have to avoid when talking to another person and trying to convince them. Trigger words, in essence. Like if a concept has a popular word to describe it, for example, socialism, the best way to sell it to someone who already attaches negative connotations to it is to describe the benefits without actually using the word. The same goes with woke. You can spend all day trying to explain wokeness to a person and even convince them that you're right, but as soon as you actually use the word, the whole thing can fall apart. It's like selling the brand and not the product itself. Emotionally responding to certain words is a normal thing, of course, and there are some things that we hear and we automatically apply meaning to, whether that's good or bad. That's just how language works. Whether you have prior experience with something related to a certain word, or if you know enough about it, there's all kinds of ways that you can establish connections with certain words. As mentioned at the start of this video though, there are people who dislike or dismiss terms without necessarily knowing what it means. I'm sure if you spend any amount of time on YouTube or social media, which I know you do because you're here, you'll have seen people online who complain about and outright despise wokeness. Generally, they're referred to as the anti-woke crowd. It's become evident though that a lot of these people really don't know what woke actually means, and they'll apply the word to quite literally anything. For example, I was gonna ask some people to read those out, but I don't know anyone that I hate enough to do that, and James Corden's people turned me down. Too busy yelling at waiters. Woke has become a word that means something to people like these, but its definition and its associations are almost always incorrect, but it's something that they believe has some ties to progressives or social justice, even if it's something as ridiculous as woke glasses, or the belief that people want to take away their giant portions of steak and eggs for breakfast, or as their doctor will call it in a few years' time, heart disease. How this has happened is deviously simple. For the past couple of years, right-wing media, both traditional and online, has been constantly repeating the term woke alongside the implication that something that they love is being taken away from them by progressives, and that by protesting, they're fighting in favor of freedom of speech and freedom to choose whatever you want. It's kind of like a form of oppositional defiant disorder. A person gets told that they can't do something, and regardless of any explanation as to why it's bad for them or others around them, they'll become argumentative and do it anyway. Like, have you ever seen those guys who go out of their way to make trucks less eco-friendly because they've been told that climate change is a hoax? Or people who refuse to recycle? Or even the ones who insist on using plastic straws or using a gas stove? Wait, that's a thing now. This is where we are now. Jesus Christ. They do it because right-wing media paints it as something that progressives came up with as a method of control, and by following it, they imply that it's a slippery slope where eventually you'll have given up most of your freedoms, possibly without even noticing it. To make it more valid, the credentials of said claims are often brought into question, telling audiences that these are decisions made by groups that they already don't trust and validated by experts whose qualifications and intentions might be suspicious or even outright wrong. Just consider how many times we see bogus or cherry-picked studies against climate change from people who believe it's not real. By changing woke into a word that simply means the leftists/liberals like it, right-wing media outlets have been able to weaponize a quick, easy-to-remember buzzword that's loaded with enough negative associations that it can be thrown into any headline and grab people's attentions, regardless of how ludicrous it seems. YouTube in particular has become a goldmine for people who want to gain views from anti-woke content, most of the time in relation to nerd culture like video games and superhero movies, which I don't understand why they're still considered nerd culture when they're literally the highest grossing movies of all time. As you're probably very well aware now, nothing drives up engagement on the internet like content that can enrage people. Whether that's a tweet or a video, people willingly go out their way to click on things that piss them off, and it's genuinely not healthy. In fact, some of you might have clicked on this video because you didn't like the title or thumbnail. If that is the case, I just want to clarify that I do not make videos with the intention of making people angry. Genuinely. With the release of almost every Marvel or Star Wars property, you will find that there is almost an immediate negative response by the anti-woke crowd, even if they've only seen a trailer. It's especially common if it's revealed that a woman or a person of color has a prominent role in something. For example, Finn and Rey in the recent Star Wars trilogy, the latter of which was accused of being a Mary Sue, a term used for a character, often female, which refers to someone who's created by a writer who is devoid of flaws, immediately liked by all, virtuous, competent in everything they do, even without prior training, physically attractive, and gifted. This trope goes all the way back to 1973 when Paula Smith created a Star Trek fanfiction, A Trekkie's Tale, which included a character named Mary Sue, with the intent of mocking other writers in the field and highlighting how these archetypes had become all too common, particularly among male writers who would create these characters as a means of bringing their idealized version of a woman into existence. The term can also be applied to men as well, but sometimes they're given the name Gary Stu instead. Very creative. There is a valid argument that the Mary Sue trope is bad. After all, if you have a character that's good at everything, loved by all, and free of flaws, then it's hard to make someone interesting that way. Good characters have weaknesses, and perfection is boring. Unless you're me. Since in recent years producers have been making a greater effort to be inclusive towards women and minorities, blockbuster movies have been the ideal venue for showcasing the talents of actors while creating more positive and prominent portrayals of marginalized people. Given that the anti-woke crowd doesn't always have the most favorable opinion of these groups though, they're quick to throw out accusations of writers creating Mary Sue characters with the intention of pandering to audiences. But this is often accompanied with the claim that men in these productions are stripped of their power and status to further enhance the power of those who aren't men, which in turn is interpreted as an attempt to undermine and undervalue men in the real world, sort of as a form of audience indoctrination to see men as lesser, something important that's worth bearing in mind later. As a result, you'll see video after video on YouTube talking about movies, shows, and video games going woke, claiming that industries are capitulating to the demands of the woke mob who have a stranglehold on the type of content that we consume, spreading propaganda designed from the ground up to underplay or omit the significance of men in the stories that we see, and in turn threaten their position in society. Media does have the ability to influence us to a startling degree, that goes without saying, but the assumption that something like a Star Wars movie, regardless of its popularity, is capable of threatening the long-standing patriarchy is a bit of a stretch. For the people who watch these videos though, much of their identity is entwined with the media that they consume. It's too important to who they are, probably too important if I'm honest. And when there's someone on screen who's the center of attention and isn't like them, it's seen as a slight. And these feelings are reinforced by influencers who cater to these feelings, who say that the reason why you don't feel valued by society is because there's a conspiracy to lessen your importance as a man through the media the masses consume. It's not treated as something that's designed to empower people other than men. It's seen as a way to diminish men. It's seen as wokeness. As I mentioned a moment ago, there has been a greater effort to give marginalized groups more time and significance on our screens. After decades of straight white leading men on our screens, the media has basically been playing catch up. It's an overall positive development, and it helps these groups and their representations, especially those who have for the longest time suffered from underrepresentation. With the recent popularity of remakes, producers have taken the opportunity to make changes to stories that better match modern sensibilities. Not everything has landed very well. There's a whole argument to be had about whether some changes have been necessary, especially in regards to plot details. But one major difference has been the inclusion or recasting of certain characters, in particular gender-swapped or race-swapped characters, and new characters who weren't in the originals. Of course, such a thing is considered wokeness among the groups who see the very existence of minorities or certain people in their media a way of promoting an agenda, which if you ask someone who feels this way what they mean by that, the answer would probably not be very clear. And despite the very obvious bigotry, you'd get claims that it's nothing against those marginalized people and that it's a stance against media producers who allegedly hate men. Disney has been on a mission in the past few years to make live-action remakes of all of their beloved animated classics, and in doing so they've made clear efforts to be more inclusive and make some adjustments to certain elements that would probably be seen as questionable during a time where people are quick to notice and announce things that are problematic, whether it's plot elements or characters that have aged poorly or actors that were inappropriately casted for the race of their characters. Unsurprisingly, the anti-woke crowd has taken issue with these changes, usually adopting the mentality of if it ain't broke, or I guess if it ain't woke, don't fix it. I'm not apologizing for that. Claiming that preservation is more important than progress, which incidentally is representative of everything that the anti-woke crowd stands for, but more on that later. With each remake Disney has released, it's become increasingly evident that they've started to be more aggressive with their changes, further angering the anti-woke crowd while being applauded by people who wish for more diversity. Now, I really hate to sound cynical, really, but I don't think it's a stretch to say that Disney are very aware of the outrage that they've caused by making such significant changes to their properties, and as a result of that, they've leaned into it. As the saying goes, there's no such thing as bad press, and people talking about the controversial changes means more coverage, and people who will pay for a movie ticket just to hate watch a movie for 2 hours of their life and to justify their anger. After all, rage equals engagement. As I was making this video, the live-action Little Mermaid remake was released in theaters worldwide, and by far its most notable change from the original animated movie was that the main character, Ariel, is now played by Halle Bailey, a black woman. Unsurprisingly, this enraged a lot of people on the right, leading to a variety of Twitter campaigns attempting to convince people to boycott the film, and Bailey receiving a torrent of racist harassment. They claim that it's an attempt to woke-wash history and force an agenda for diversity, going as far as to claim it's erasing white people from the media. Of course, this sentiment was pandered to and promoted to the extreme by conservatives, who came up with all sorts of ludicrous justifications as to why it's a bad thing, including Matt Walsh, a man who makes your uncle's Thanksgiving rants seem sane, who said, and I quote, "With The Little Mermaid, can we just mention that from a scientific perspective, it doesn't make a lot of sense to have someone with darker skin who lives deep in the ocean. If anything, not only should The Little Mermaid be pale, she should actually be translucent. Look at the deep sea creatures, they're like translucent, they have no kind of pigmentation whatsoever, and they're just like these horrifying skeletons floating around in the ocean. That's what the Little Mermaid should look like. They should be totally pale and skeletal, where you can see her skull through her face, and that would actually be a version of the Little Mermaid that I would want to watch." Yes, Matt, mermaids, the totally real and not mythological creatures, should scientifically not be black. That's a very reasonable and not at all nonsensical argument that works in your favor. I'm sure that kids would love nothing more than seeing a translucent torso attached to a fishtail singing delightful songs and walking around with humans. I mean, just imagine trying to use the science of mermaids to justify your racism. Maybe wait for the darker Del Toro remake, Matt. I don't know. Matt. As I said though, if a person's identity is heavily wrapped up in the media that they consume, they are prone to being angry about it when it conflicts with their view of the world, whether it's a movie or even a YouTube video. People react to that negatively because it feels personal. It can feel especially powerful when they have a nostalgic attachment to certain properties, something which I spoke about in possibly my favorite video, How Nostalgia Killed the Future, which you should definitely watch because you're missing out on it. Even Darman said that it's great. Quote here. It's the best video on YouTube. Also, I love scamming people. It makes me feel alive. Like God, actually. Actually greater than God. Darman, 2032 AD. Citation needed. .gif. Corporations going woke are a sign that the world is changing and becoming more accepting of people from different backgrounds. It is a sign of progress, but it's also a way for them to reach out to a wider range of consumers and capitalize on progress, something which has been dubbed rainbow capitalism, where companies piggyback on things like the recognition and rights of marginalized groups and incorporate it into their brand identity. As great as progress and recognition is, I'm sure I don't have to tell you, but this is exploitation. Not only of people who form more positive opinions of corporations when seeing their commitment to progress and diversity, but of the marginalized groups they're attaching their brand to. It's using their identity to sell products, and I doubt I have to explain to you why that's gross. Corporations have started to become more woke for the simplest of reasons, and that's because it's profitable. It humanizes corporations, and we're at the point in time where the risk of it damaging their brand is minimal compared to the gains. Some brands still backpedal from the backlash from the anti-woke crowd. For example, when Bud Light hired trans influencer Dylan Mulvaney to advertise their fizzy piss water, they followed it up with the most generic patriotic beer ad imaginable. After Target came under fire for releasing a line of pride-themed clothing, in an act of cowardice, they took them off their shelves. In their defense though, their employees did receive numerous threats from people who are clearly being very level-headed and normal. But you have to take stuff like that seriously. Still, for every person on social media who expresses their disappointment and fury with a brand who they've allegedly been buying from for years, it's still free press for a corporation. Advertising ain't cheap, and almost any kind of press is a good way of getting a brand in people's faces, and at the end of the day, controversy doesn't really harm them. If anything, it helps. So, with the bottom line in mind, and the general success that comes with appealing to diversity, why is it that so many people believe that if you go woke, you go broke? What's up guys, this is a Truth Moose, and once again I'm about to give you the truth about the woke agenda. One thing I keep seeing in video games is when you create a character, and when you choose whether you want to be a guy or a girl, it says body type. Not man or woman, just body type. Diablo 4, Street Fighter 6, Elden Ring, it's everywhere. It might not seem like a big deal, but this is the woke mob trying to shove their billion genders in our faces, even though there are dozens of scientific papers that say otherwise, which I have definitely read. Just remember guys, if you get woke, you go broke. And that's what'll happen here. Before I forget, this episode's sponsor is the new mobile game Wallet Destroyer, a seriously addictive, I am so sorry for this terrible accent. Get woke, go broke has become a rallying cry from conservatives and self-proclaimed centrists, usually heard when a product is released by a corporation and supposedly fails to meet financial expectations. As mentioned earlier, what wokeness means to these people is vague, broad, and often absurd. It can be anything from the inclusion of LGBTQ+ characters, or even something as innocuous as the existence of a woman or a person of color. Think I'm joking about that last one? Like, look at this. Like, oh no, a black woman existing in an ad. How woke, how awful. That's from the UK, I'm embarrassed about that one. In reality though, woke products rarely do fail. They may underperform, at least against the unreasonable expectations of the companies that produce them, but in most cases they're successful, resoundingly so. Back when the video game Battlefield 5 was released, it was used as a prime example of how wokeness deterred customers from purchasing the game, specifically because it was based in World War II and featured a woman soldier on the front cover, and has them as a character. It did fail to meet the sales targets set by the publisher, EA, but as video games go, it wasn't really a failure, having sold approximately 7.4 million units within 3 months of its release, which is nothing to turn your nose up at. And it's worth considering that pretty much all major game publishers create unreasonable sales expectations for their big releases. There are so many reasons behind a game underperforming, a lack of marketing and poor critical reception often being significant reasons, but wokeness is not a reason. The thing is, if you're someone who spends much of your time following industries like video games, movies, TV, etc., you are in the minority. You may be part of a target market, but you are not the only demographic that producers are interested in. The fact is, the majority of people that buy into these things are just regular people who see them in an ad or a trailer and make a decision based on that. They don't go searching for news articles and reviews, they don't follow Twitter accounts or critics on YouTube, they make a decision based on their gut. The real money comes from those people. The kind who saw a 15-second ad on their social media feed, then look at movie listings on a Saturday afternoon and watch whatever's showing in the next hour. The kind who visit Best Buy after work on a Friday because they felt like playing a new game this weekend. The hardcore fans matter to producers since they're the ones that are likely to spend money on things like merchandise, but relatively speaking, they're small fry. One thing I can say with absolute certainty though is that the largest audiences do not care about wokeness being in the things that they consume, certainly not to the point where it can make or break it. The idea of a product underperforming due to the inclusion of progressive ideals is a myth, something that angry bigots like to claim as a reality as a means of validating their idea that the rest of the world's values align with their own, that people are using their wallets to fight against leftist agendas. It's the same with movies too. All of these modern blockbuster movies with supposedly woke elements practically never fail. At worst, they didn't crack that coveted billion-dollar box office mark, but that's really it. Star Wars isn't failing, Captain Marvel didn't flop, and all of those Disney remakes perform depressingly well. Off topic here, but let's be real here. The biggest sin of these remakes is that they're all so dull. They are soulless husks of their animated progenitor. They all have these grim, dull color palettes, the songs are weak, they're way too long, and they're too obsessed with realism. Who wants to see photorealistic, expressionless lions talking and singing? Who wants to see an actual crab, empirically the ugliest creature on Earth, be friends with a mermaid? These movies are just another way for Disney to capitalize on nostalgia while giving some legal grounds to hang on to copyrights that shouldn't belong to them anyway. It is as cynical as it gets. Please stop watching these movies. Anyway, it just isn't true. Most people just don't care about this stuff, and no amount of negative user reviews on Rotten Tomatoes or Metacritic can change that reality, especially when those reviews are the results of a coordinated campaign by anti-woke crowds who automatically reject any text that doesn't align with their values, whether or not they actually consume it. The demonization of wokeness isn't exclusive to the entertainment and products we consume though. Obviously this runs much deeper than that. As we've already touched upon, the fear of progressive movements has existed for a very long time, and it's something that's been instigated by so many different groups, including governments who actively try to undermine political movements among their own populations. I don't want to get too into this, but COINTELPRO was a very early and notable example of this, where the FBI actively attempted to sabotage various organizations in the United States that they deemed subversive under a veil of secrecy. This included feminists, the Communist Party USA, anti-war Vietnam organizers, civil rights activists, the Black Panthers, Martin Luther King Jr., animal rights movements, labor unions, the American Indian movement, and many more. Their aim was to discredit, disrupt, and destroy these organizations, deeming them un-American. This operation was highly illegal, violating numerous constitutional rights, and was discovered in 1971 when a Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI burgled it from their field office in Pennsylvania. Even back then, part of the FBI's operation involved using what they defined as labels without meanings, which in their report they admitted that labels created by the FBI, such as New Left, had no real definition and were rather seen as an attitude. COINTELPRO is a highly complex topic which, although relevant to this video, is something that deserves its own spotlight given the staggering influence it had on American and international politics. Because of this, I'm not going to delve too deep into it, but I bring it up because its existence is at least worth noting in regards to the subject. I may make a video on it someday, but right now I recommend that you look it up. If you pay any attention to politics, you'll have noticed politicians around the world frequently using the word woke in recent times. It's almost always used in a pejorative way and spoken by members of conservative parties as a means of grabbing the attention of voters who already have a pre-established negative association with the word. For right-wing lawmakers, it's something to fight against. For left-leaning or even moderate lawmakers, it's a word to be avoided, as to not scare voters who recoil at the sound of it. After all, to them, a vote's a vote, even if it's a vote from a bigot. In the aftermath of Donald Trump's presidency, right-wing politicians have campaigned heavily on the back of the fight against wokeness and all it stands for. It's treated as a threat to the American way of life, an attempt to subvert traditional values which supposedly made the country great and tip the balance of power towards those who wish to corrupt innocent youths, eventually allowing the powers that be to manipulate them into doing their bidding. It all sounds very dramatic, I know, but that's ultimately what the truth is to these people. If you're thinking that it sounds like something that links to existing conspiracy theories, notably the ones which claim that powerful secret Jewish-led organizations are attempting to seize power over the populace, then you'd be right. But honestly, most conspiracies lead down that road, even the stuff like flat earth theory, believe it or not. The word woke has been weaponized by conservative lawmakers, and it's been an extremely effective tactic that has been paying off and will continue to do so. As you can imagine, their usage of the word has been, to say the least, fluid. And I know I'm repeating myself here, but the actual meaning of wokeness doesn't matter in this context. All they need to know is that, once again, woke equals bad. Recently, the fight against wokeness has involved protesting against the academic field of critical race theory, or CRT. CRT is something that was originally used in legal studies as a means of studying how the American legal structure constructs race and racial power, but eventually these studies found their way into other academic fields as a means of examining other racial structures in society. This is something which was eventually noticed by politicians and media outlets who claimed that parents were reporting that their children were being taught about America's historically sordid conflict with race at their schools. Considering how academic curriculums in the US whitewash the country's history, this had conservatives worried and claimed that the goal of CRT was to force white children into feeling guilt for events that they weren't directly responsible for, very obviously missing the point behind teaching these parts of history. But what else can you expect from a country where 12% of its citizens think that Joan of Arc was Noah's wife? Sorry, I don't mean to sound condescending, but come on. Much like woke, CRT became yet another buzzword, or I guess buzz initialism, that conservatives were very aware of but didn't have any solid definition for it, even though in reality it did have one. Instead, CRT was just another symbol to them. It was another threat to the reputation of white Americans, a way to make people ignore all of the good that they've done for society and instead focus on all of the bad. This assumption, other than being incorrect, is a purposefully simplified assessment of a vast academic field, one which none of its detractors understood and weren't willing to understand. What mattered to them was that it was a study about race, and when taught in the context of America, its racist history will inevitably require acknowledgement. The intent behind CRT isn't to make white people feel guilty. If it does, then that's just incidental. Conservatives like to claim that racism isn't a problem anymore and that America hasn't been as racist as people like to claim, treating something like slavery as a mistake rather than a conscious effort to subjugate people based on the color of their skin. They believe that racism ended after the civil rights movement, ignoring institutional racism and even the country's very, very shady history with eugenics, which went all the way into the 70s. Later, if you consider the stuff that they did around the world. We're going to talk about this stuff in a future video, by the way. It is way more f***ed up than you think it is. With the meaning of CRT twisted beyond recognition, conservative lawmakers and pundits were able to effectively use it as yet another dog whistle to rile up audiences, without offering any explanation as to what it means. All that mattered was that it's part of the woke agenda, therefore it needs to be defeated, and that's all some politicians needed to pass legislation which ensured that it would be illegal to teach it in schools. It's all part of the long game, really. Conservatives want to preserve traditional values and want people to see the country as a great place that may have made a few mistakes, but has historically served as a force for good in the world. They maintain that for America to be great, it's important that traditional values are taught in schools, that patriotism is something that should be instilled in every American from birth and fed a steady diet of it throughout their entire lives, from the institutions they attend to the media they consume. Education is a threat to conservative politicians because learning about the country and its history can inevitably lead to questions about its greatness and whether maintaining the values that are supposedly great is something that would benefit everyone. It would also be something that would lead young Americans to realize that the country has been built on the back of oppression, and when you consider that America's unique selling point is that it's allegedly the freest country in the world, then you don't need to be a genius to realize that there are flaws in that. If people learn about those flaws through education, then the Republican Party, who wishes to uphold these traditional values, loses voters. With all this in mind, their war against CRT becomes simple. Take a complex academic field, remove its meaning, claim it will harm children, ban it, control the narrative of America's history, and secure future voters to continue the cycle. Arguably the biggest and most noteworthy opponent of CRT is Governor of Florida and anti-wokeness warrior Ron DeSantis, a man who answers the question, what if a hemorrhoid could talk? DeSantis has become the most vocal opponent of wokeness, going as far as saying that the state of Florida is the place where, much like your grandparents, woke goes to die. How am I not writing for Last Week Tonight with all of these mediocre jokes? In early 2022, DeSantis successfully signed into law a bill that would ban educators from teaching CRT in K-12 classrooms, which for those of you outside of America means kindergarten to grade 12. This was done despite the fact that nothing even resembling CRT was being taught as part of the curriculum, something which DeSantis himself acknowledged, claiming that the principles of CRT are entering children's education, which he dubbed as a form of indoctrination. To really illustrate DeSantis' obsession with wokeness, this piece of legislation was literally called the Stop Woke Act. Woke being an acronym that stands for Wrongs to Our Kids and Employees. They really tried their hardest to turn that into an acronym. As ridiculous as people like DeSantis may seem, they are a very real danger. He's going to be running for the presidency in 2024, and it would be a huge mistake to believe his chances of winning are low. After all, few people believed that Trump would win in 2016, and we saw how that worked out. DeSantis also apparently has the endorsement of Elon Musk, which is worrying and not at all surprising to say the least, since he seems to base all of his politics around South Park episodes. DeSantis and his ilk create laws, and the Stop Woke Act is touted as something which is supposed to prevent the indoctrination of people. But hypocritically, it is actually intended to ensure that America's youths are indoctrinated with different values. The anti-woke crowd constantly claims that those who campaign for social justice are in favor of censorship, but what would he call this? It violates students' rights to see information. It enables legal action against educators who teach provable facts, forcing them to censor themselves. And the bill itself is incredibly murkily defined, which is a huge problem with laws, since that opens it up to being improperly applied. Even legal experts have said that the bills are so vaguely written that it's unclear what they will affirmatively cover. Thankfully, the act hasn't been fully enforced. District Judge Mark E. Walker declared that the bill contained elements that were unconstitutional and issued a temporary injunction which prevents it from being enforced in colleges and universities. That's just one area that is blocked in though. It's still being enforced elsewhere, and I don't have to tell you this, but that's a huge problem and a disgusting abuse of government power. It's very possible that this whole thing will inspire other states and possibly even other countries to follow suit. Controlling the flow of information is an extremely effective way of creating a populace that unquestionably follows the word of its leaders. The war against wokeness has created a situation in which people who are against it believe that they are soldiers in a war against those who wish to take away their freedoms, but in a grand stroke of irony, they're doing the opposite. They're actively campaigning to censor access and effectively erase history and legitimate research because politicians, news networks, and pundits have told them that it's for the greater good, and that the average person is better informed and more righteous than any expert. In a sense, it's like convincing a parent to cut out part of their child's brain to blind them to the parts of reality they find objectionable. This campaign to convince people to believe that by taking away their freedoms, they would be in turn gaining more freedom, it's kind of genius. In a really sick way. It's the kind of thing that will make Putin jealous. So, here we are. A new reality where the word woke is likely to inspire anger and suspicion in people than anything else. Its meaning has become secondary or tertiary, and even the people who came up with the term know better than to use it. Yes, the usage of words lower over time, language evolves, trends change, so there's a chance we wouldn't be using it now anyway. I mean, who still says on fleek, other than your mother when she's trying to look cool? She's just trying to understand you. Call your mother, she's been through a lot. After all this though, it's safe to say that the mutation of the word woke has undoubtedly been intentional. As I mentioned earlier, this isn't the first time that this has happened, and it definitely will not be the last. Now, I don't like to dabble in philosophy too much in my videos. I've read a decent amount, but in general, I just rather talk about these things without being in the shadow of smart, thinky men. I know a bunch of you are philosophy nerds, and whenever I do mention a philosopher, I end up with a bunch of comments that start with things like, actually Nietzsche meant... Plus, I don't take myself too seriously. I'm not above a funny fart sound. People who watch my stream will attest to that. In fact, here's a funny fart sound now. I didn't even hear it. That being said, I'd like to draw attention to Baudrillard's Simulacra and Simulation. In his seminal work, Baudrillard describes the phases in which a sign, which in this case means a word, goes through 4 stages in which reality transforms its definition as concepts, associated images, and language move from being connected to reality to divorced from it, to the point where it bears no resemblance to reality anymore, creating what he described as a hyper-reality. Phase 1 is where the image has a strong connection to reality. Its definition is clear and identifiable to everyone. Phase 2 is where the image is obscured, where people begin to question a sign's appearance. It resembles a copy of its original meaning but is unfaithful to it, which, as Baudrillard says, masks and denatures reality. Phase 3 is where a sign becomes a copy with no original. It has become disconnected from its original meaning. This is where the sign takes on other meanings, perhaps even multiple ones to different people. The final phase is where the sign bears no resemblance to reality whatsoever. Its definition can be fluid or rigid, but nonetheless, it is completely removed from what it once meant. It has become a simulacrum. It bears a resemblance to our reality, but is so disconnected from reality that even though it exists, its new form is the only thing that people are willing to accept. So why is this important? Put simply, this isn't something that occurs naturally, especially in our modern times. Our definitions of words and images have become something that people with power and influence intentionally change to fit their own definition, to distort and repurpose existing signs to manipulate people. They can take something that's already established and has its associations with reality, change that reality using rhetoric and PR to make something new, and in the case of the word woke, something evil. Is it a bad thing that the word woke no longer has its original meaning? On one hand, you could argue it's just a word, and what it represents isn't gonna disappear anytime soon. On the other hand, it has been effectively weaponized and turned against people to actively encourage the oppression of those who are already heavily oppressed. As things stand, if right-wing politicians and personalities want to mobilize their supporters, all they have to do is use a single word to let them know that it's bad. Woke. How do we fight against this from happening again? I honestly don't have a proper answer to this, and I definitely don't have the power or influence to make any profound dent in what I believe to be a very real problem. Science will change no matter how hard you try. What I would advise though is that you do whatever you can to prevent this from happening on a ground level, namely with the people that you're close to. If there's someone that you know who likes to use words like woke, leftist, socialism, etc. in a derogatory way, ask them to define what these words mean to them, and if they're off the mark, then try and explain why they're incorrect. It should go without saying, but please don't talk down to people when you're trying to win them over. That never works. Be compassionate and sell them the positives of the things that they believe to be bad. Take for example, if someone uses Antifa in a negative sense, ask them what they think it means. Chances are they'll be wrong. You can explain that it stands for anti-fascist and ask them whether they would be in favor of fascism, which in most cases, sadly not all, people would be opposed to. You can then explain that it's not a well-funded organization, but more of an idea, and even possibly go as far as to say that since they're against fascism, then they're technically considered Antifa too. When people have these incorrect and set definitions of words in their head, the very least you can attempt to do is break it down and offer the truth behind it. Whether a person accepts that or not is up to them, but words are power, and as it's become evident, it's very easy to have that power turned against people who need them. The bare minimum might not feel like enough. I really understand that, but it is something and it's still worthwhile. Do what you can to help the people that you care about. Have these difficult conversations, but still show that you love them. And, just keep trying. Do your best. Thank you for watching. If you like the video, then some engagement would be appreciated, especially if you want to click on that subscribe button, maybe the notification bell, whatever you're comfortable with really. While you're enjoying this footage of our cats eating tube treats, I'd like to thank all the patrons that you see on screen and give a shout out to the following: Liana Pidgeot, Syndrome Noir, JP, Minty, Infernal Ramblings, Malcontent, Jacob Mayer, Zoe B, J Miz, Mech, Ellis Wren, Joseph Blair, Jonathan Morris, Rose Jane, Caro Schultz, Bailey Grevling, Gerzonbear, Catherine Pendell, Candide, Dan McCrary, Remy Allen, Grant B, Merger Fashionable, Alina, R. Atoms, Games, Sharfay, Mickey Bonadonna, Sparrowwagon, Hawaiian Juicebox, Dylan Wera Singh, Ruby O'Connor, Thomas Tomacano, Tadeo Dioria, Ryan Osterman, Alicia Crawford, Jay, Catherine, Gina I, Henry the Longshot, Lizzie Peasy, King Me, Fishcatch, Unevens, The Paultism, I Am M, Pauper Stifle Dandelion, Haplo, Tande, Gertz Weinreich, BestFriendsGang.tv, Charlie, Chris Smothers, Locked In, Kev Yu, Lucky Number Devon, Matthew Torres, and Steve Marr. Thank you all so much for your support. It really does make a difference. YouTube revenue has been garbage recently. I did the math, and for my last video, I basically got paid less than $4 an hour for my work. So if you fancy lending a hand too, it'd be greatly helpful. If not, then sharing this video also helps a bunch. Anyway, sorry for the long wait on this one. As mentioned recently, I've been going through some stuff, so thanks for your patience. In the meantime, I stream every week on twitch.tv/jsalari, and you can join the Discord if you want to join a community of lovely people. Thank you to Dylan Reid Miller once again for lending a hand with the research, and yeah, that's everything, I believe. Be well.